One problem with the techniques covered in this training and the sort of manipulations we're making to procedural terrains is that we don't always have a real-time refresh of the geometry on our terrain. So there's a very quick tool we can create, which is basically a macro in order to refresh our terrain. And basically what we're doing is just playing back us opening the terrain editor and closing it. Very simple operation, although we do have to keep a few things in mind when making this. First of all, if we right mouse click on our terrain and edit the object, depending on the complexity of the object we're using in the scene, and some fractals can take a very long time to generate this preview, what we can do is with any terrain you're using this sort of a manipulator on and the object control we've created, take your pixel resolution of the procedural terrain and turn it down as low as it will go, which is 8 by 8. So 8 pixels by 8 pixels. Now this isn't going to affect the geometry of your terrain at all, and what those 8 pixels are for is being able to paint onto the procedural and basically adding an image on top of whatever altitude production you've created. So what we've done is create an extremely fast refresh. Open the terrain editor, close it, open it, close it, and it's a very quick refresh of our terrain. So how can we make this faster instead of having to double click every single time we want this terrain to refresh? Another thing you might notice too is depending on where you click on the terrain sometimes, if it doesn't open the terrain editor by double clicking, you can sometimes move closer to the pivot position or where the gizmo's at to get that to open. Otherwise, what I usually do is just right mouse click and edit the object, which is normally the quickest way. But right now what we want to do is just have a simple operation to open and close the terrain editor. So all we have to do is record a macro. Now we need to keep in mind the type of macro this is going to be. If you're working with multiple terrains in the scene, then you're going to want to create scene-specific macros where you start out the macro with nothing selected. Because our macro we're going to create is going to repeat the exact operations we perform. So selecting the terrain itself is going to become part of the macro. So if you want to refresh specific terrains, then you're going to want to record the selecting of your terrain and then opening the terrain editor and closing it. If you want just a universal function to work on the selected terrain, which is what I usually do, and it probably ends up being one of the best methods, we're going to stick with having the terrain selected first. So in other words, in order to use this macro we're going to record, you have to have a terrain selected. If you're working with your controller objects, then maybe you'd want to have a macro that's going to select your terrain, but what it's going to do is select the name of your terrain. So you're going to have to set up specific names for your terrains and also your macros. So let's go ahead and just do this really quick rather than rambling on about it. So with our terrain selected, we can go up to the top and click the record button, and now we're recording our macro. And double click on our terrain and click OK. And now we can stop the macro. And I've already got this saved out as terrain refresher. I'll just go ahead and overwrite my file, click save. And now we need an easy way to access this macro. The best way to really do this is going to have a keyboard shortcut. Rather than having to go up to automation, recent macros, if you have it loaded in, or loading the macro quick launch. So what we want to do is use the quick launch And first we'll go to Automation, Macro Quick Launch, click Edit. Now we can add in our macro that we just created. And I've named mine Terrain Refresher. And this is also available with the training within the content directory. So now we have a macro loaded into our Quick Launch editor. Now you can load any macros you want into here. Once these macros are loaded into the Quick Launch editor, they become available as keyboard shortcuts under File, Options, and the Operations tab. So once we find the automation section, we can see we have the recent macros that can be assigned to keyboard shortcuts, and also our macro quick launch. So now we can assign a keyboard shortcut, and I'm going to assign mine to F1 and just replace whatever I have, which is by default is the help and overview for the application. So now we have this set to F1. I'm going to click OK, and now at any time we can select our terrain, hit F1, and it's just going to refresh our terrain, making sure that we have it selected first. And also making sure that we set up that pixel amount as the lowest possible first, just so that refresh is as quick as possible. So overall, there's a little bit of a wait for the terrain editor to open and then close, but for the most part, it's pretty fast. And there's probably a much better way to program this, probably with a Python script. But a quick little macro is fast and it works. So when you're working with procedural terrains for this technique, this can be really helpful.